All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This week we will be looking at what became of realist fiction over the course of the late 20th century. So, some of the weeks in this course have themes that are more oriented toward literary genres and literary ideas like realism or tragedy in the drama sections, and some of them have more, socially historically themed themes, if you will, like when we talked about the literature of the 60s and the literature of multiculturalism and of postmodernism. So this is one with a bit more of a literary genre focus than one that's necessarily confined to one thematic, ideological, historical tendency. We're going to see a couple different ideological, historical tendencies at work here. But what we want to look at is what became of realist fiction, because that's one of the places the course started. That was one of our early weeks. We looked at the realist fiction of the mid-century. And then when we were looking at postmodernism and multiculturalism, we saw the ways that realist fiction was challenged by experimental postmodern fiction in writers like Grace Paley and Thomas Pynchon, and as well by genre fiction. Particularly, we looked at science fiction in the works of Philip K. Dick and Ursula K. Le Guin, and more implicitly, and I actually want to draw this out a little bit more this week, by some of the assumptions of multiculturalism, which brought magical realism into the conversation. So, but what I don't want to leave you with is the impression that realism sort of went away, that it was just sort of vanquished by postmodernism and the rise of genre fiction and multiculturalism. I think realism has always been a part of prose fiction from the beginnings in Europe in the 18th century and remains a part today, even if its dominance is no longer unquestioned in the way that it was in the middle of the 20th century, when it really had a hegemonic role in the literary world. So we want to see what became of realism sort of after these challenges were issued, and where realism as a literary genre went. So we're going to talk about four writers, and I use the word realisms. So I borrowed that redux from last week. So last week we did modern tragedy redux, where we looked at how August Wilson was bringing back tragedy in the way that we saw Tennessee Williams using it. And so redux just means the return, to revisit, to go back. So I call it realisms redux, but I use realisms because there's not just one form of realism. I think in this period, we have multiple forms that have generally been labeled. So we're going to look at four different writers representing four different tendencies within realism. Something that was called dirty realism, or sometimes minimalism, in Raymond Carver. We're going to look at magical realism in Louise Erdrich. We're going to look at lyrical realism in John Updike, and we're going to look at postmodern realism, because postmodernism isn't necessarily just a challenge to realism, but can also be incorporated with it in Don DeLillo. So that's going to be the topic of this week, and there will be four relatively short lectures on each of these four writers and tendencies. And this one will be on Raymond Carver, but it will also sort of set the terms of the discussion as well. And the illustration on my slide is just, so when I did the first realism lecture, I showed you the paperbacks of the paperback revolution of the mid-20th century, if you remember, on my first slide. And so for this one, when I think of realism at the end of the 20th century, particularly in the 80s. We're going to spend most of this week in the 80s. I think of these, the particular cover designs of the publisher Vintage. Vintage did a series called the Vintage Contemporaries, where they published contemporary, largely realist authors, such as Raymond Carver and Don DeLillo. And they had a very famous cover design that just sort of reeks of 80s design. And so that's what this topic makes me think of. So that's why I chose that as my illustration. And some people really like these, and even they're almost collector's items to a certain point. I don't actually have that many of them. I'm looking at my bookshelf. I think I have a Don DeLillo book in this edition, but otherwise I mostly don't have these books. Well, they're a little before my time. So anyway, I'm rambling. So let's get on with the topic. So one thing I do want to point out, it's been a while since we've paused to discuss historical context, because we looked at the historical context of the social movements of the 60s and how that led to multiculturalism in the 1980s. And I broadly gestured to what was going on in the 70s and 80s when we talked about multiculturalism, but I was much more focused on multiculturalism as a distinct movement within that context. So I want to think more broadly about the 80s as we did earlier in the class, thinking more broadly about the 50s and the 60s. You're probably thinking, what happened to the 70s? Well, I think the 70s, for our purposes, half of the 70s was the 60s, and the other half of the 70s is the 80s. So, decades, when we speak of them in this metaphorical sense, aren't really about a 10-year period. They're about a cultural mood, or about certain political, economic, social developments that aren't neatly confined to 10-year period. So the 80s, for our purposes here, probably goes from the late 70s to the early 90s. So what is this broader context? So one of the things we've already talked about is this development of multiculturalism in literature that starts in the 60s and goes really through the end of the 20th century. But in broader terms, what's going on in culture and society in the 1980s? So I think one thing you could think of is it's kind of an echo of the 50s. It's a more conservative time. It's a more conservative period. You have a pretty strong backlash to the developments of the 1960s. You have and this is, so multiculturalism is happening in literary and academic circles, but the broader culture, particularly the political culture, with the rise of neoconservatism and the 12 years of Republican rule at the presidential level with the Reagan and Bush administrations, is a much more conservative sort of backlash against the 1960s. So it's a period of conservatism in politics, and in some respects in popular culture as well. Also, the other thing that reminds me of the 50s about the 80s is you have a period of vast technological and economic change happening as well, which occasions a great deal of anxiety. So there's a lot of anxiety in the popular culture, a lot of portrayals of disaster and widespread calamity. And we're going to see that in Don DeLillo's work here this week in Don DeLillo's White Noise. So what are the economic and technological changes I'm talking about? So for one thing, economics moves away from state control and becomes much more deregulated. So this is what's often called neoliberalism, where the word liberalism there refers not so much to what you might think of as liberalism in politics, but it's liberalism as it's used in economics, where it refers to this idea of laissez-faire, Laissez hyphen FAIRE, a French phrase literally meaning let them do as they please. But essentially the idea is a purely free market, that the state will not regulate the market or in any way take control of the commanding heights of the economy to control things like prices or wages or anything like that. The state will just take a hands-off approach and let the economy just sort of do as it pleases, though, of course, to say this obscures, what is the economy? The economy is choices human beings make. And so what happens when the state recedes in this way? Well, you see corporations come to the fore in doing as they please. And what do they want to do? They want to maximize their profits. And so you see one of the things we talked about as the context for postmodernism is the increasing globalization of capitalism, so that corporations can, take manufacturing away from highly regulated countries like the United States when certain regulations are removed, and then have their products made and built in countries with lesser regulation where they can pay lower wages, which does have the effect of creating cheaper consumer goods in the United States. So we become more and more a consumer economy. And this deregulation, this neoliberalism gets started in the 70s. and a lot of the cultural mood that accompanied it was part of that 60s counterculture, this libertarian, anarchic ethos of not, this is the one, this is not believing in grand narratives applied to economics. The state shouldn't apply a grand narrative, a grand purpose, a grand goal for economics. The state should withdraw and let the pluralism of the market develop as it will. And that's the utopian way of putting it. The dystopian way of putting it is then you just have this sort of profit maximization without any concern for what's happening to culture, to people, to workers, to the environment, etc. And so it creates this consumer culture. So in that sense, you might say this neoliberalism, neoliberal economics is kind of a mixed bag. Along with this consumer culture, you get things like video games, personal computing, portable cassette players, portable boom boxes, as they used to be called. They mark the beginning of a culture of technology, and particularly computers and digital culture moving in on everyday life. So the 80s is really the period where you start to see this merging of technology with everyday life and with almost the physical person. The 80s is the first period where you see people walking around on the street with headphones, in that sense, kind of like regressed from the social in their own world of media enabled by technology. The 80s is where you start to see personal computers becoming, part of everyday life in middle-class homes. You start to see video gaming as a part of recreation, as a kind of cultural form, comes up in the 80s. So you have this technological transformation as well. That goes with this economic transformation, and they're related because you have this, these cheaper consumer goods. Neoliberalism allows for the making of these cheaper consumer goods, such as personal electronic devices, and so that thing that we so much take for granted as part of our everyday life, that you have all this media at your disposal, physically on your person, in your pocket, in the phone. The smartphone doesn't exist yet, but the 80s is the period in which this expectation for life becomes set in stone with these cheaper consumer goods. And then the other thing I want to talk about, and I want to hold off on a discussion. I mentioned anxiety, disaster. I think that's a big part of 80s culture, but I'm going to talk about that when we get to Don DeLillo. I want to use that as the kind of frame to talk about DeLillo's work. So I'm going to hold off on that, except to say one thing, which is that the Cold War reaches a kind of climax and a conclusion in this period. So we began, when we talked about the 50s, talking about the Cold War, the threat of nuclear annihilation caused by these, nuclear armed superpowers in this global standoff, the paranoia created by the Cold War, the idea that both sides' intelligence services are listening in at any time, that anybody could be a spy or a double agent. The 80s sees a revision, a revisitation of this as it comes to a climax. So this goes back to Ronald Reagan. You see him there. By the way, my image, I have no idea where I got this picture anymore. I made a slide like this when I first started teaching this class about 5 years ago, and I no longer remember where I got this image, but this image is just like visual iconography of the 80s. And so Ronald Reagan there, our what president? Our 40th president is pictured at the left of the image. He comes into office in and he wins the 1980 election, comes into office in 1981, and one of his goals is to not just, so the idea was in the 70s, the pursuit of presidential administrations like Nixon's to some extent, and then Jimmy Carter's, was what was called to contain the Soviet Union. Containment, or in French, détente. We would sort of live with them in some tense but livable arrangement. And Ronald Reagan comes into office with a more belligerent, a more belligerently conservative attitude, and says, no, I would like to defeat them. I would like to defeat the Soviet Union. I would like to defeat communism and wipe it out of history. And so with this greater belligerence, he pursues a goal of increasing the nuclear arms race with them, at least in his first term, and then later on he makes some treaties. But I'm not a political scientist or historian, so you can take all this with a grain of salt. But at least initially, he challenges them much more frontally, leads them into an arms race with the intention. So the anxiety at the time was that this would lead to nuclear war. So the 80s is probably the period of the greatest fear of nuclear war after the 50s. And you see this reflected in a lot of the popular culture. And Reagan deliberately said belligerent things, I think, well, I don't want to accuse him of trying to deliberately stoke this anxiety, but some of the things he said stoked this anxiety. There's the famous story of him being caught on a hot microphone joking the bombing starts in 5 minutes, which would lead to a nuclear war. So there was all this anxiety. But I think his goal, or what happened anyway in the end, was to sort of outspend them, to sort of outmaneuver their economy. And this along with a lot of other factors, and again, I'm not a historian or a political scientist, but this does lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s, where there's the fall of the Berlin Wall, dividing Berlin between the communist-controlled East and the West in 1989, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, with consequences we'll discuss later in the course, the so-called end of history. But before that happens, you have this rising tension of the Cold War period. So that's the 80s in general. That's kind of the framing context I want to give you for these stories. 3 of them are from the 80s, and then one of them, I think, is the John Updike is from the mid to late 70s. But this will be enough context for that. And you can even retrospectively imply this to some of the other stuff we've been looking at, because most of the things we read in the last 2 weeks were also texts of the 1980s as well, though I wanted to dwell more on their association with that post-60s multicultural movement. All right, so enough context. Let's talk about our first story and our first writer. In many ways, a writer whose realist short stories are sort of synonymous with the 1980s, Raymond Carver. So who was Raymond Carver? He lived from 1938 to 1988, not a very long life, unfortunately. And he was a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. So we talked about that way back in the beginning of the course with Flannery O'Connor. We talked about the rise of the Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing in the middle of the 20th century, and how the professionalization of the sort of job of creative writer, whether fiction writer or poet, or even so-called creative nonfiction writer, is a big part of 20th century literature. So Carver is a good example of that. He was a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, which I also paranoidically mentioned that had some CIA funding as well, because well, I don't want to say because it's too complicated to just say because, but maybe we can talk about it in a minute. But anyway, he was a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and his stories in the 1980s really set almost a standard for realist fiction in this period. He was seen as sort of the realist short story writer, and the style in which he wrote became almost the house style of the realist short story at the end of the 20th century. Now, it wasn't wholly original. In many ways, he is picking up on things that had been done by earlier writers in the realist tradition, particularly Flannery O'Connor, and then in the period before this course starts, Ernest Hemingway, a writer you're probably a little bit familiar with. I think he's still taught in high school to a certain extent. So Carver is continuing a certain realist tradition, but he's taking it also to a certain extreme. Particularly in terms of style, though the question is who's taking it to an extreme. We'll get to that in a minute. But the style of his early stories takes it to an extreme. And the content is also a little bit extreme because Carver is a working class writer. He's born in a working class situation, and he writes mostly from the perspective of working class and lower middle class life. Particularly set, not always, but particularly set in the West. He lived most of his life in California, Oregon, and Washington, and so that's a lot of where his stories are set there. Not the one we read. The one we read is apparently set in New York State, it appears, from the kind of geography we're given. But that's not all that typical of his work. His work more has a Western setting. And so what was he known for? He was known for what was called his minimalism or his dirty realism, in which he told stories of lower middle class or working class life. And not just any stories, but stories that emphasize the desperation and the degradation of working class and lower middle class life. Particularly, he focused on alcoholism, which was something he struggled with, as well as struggles with money and the way this puts strain on relationships between family members, between husbands and wives, between parents and children, and between men and women. He has a particularly, I think, often dystopian view of marriage, of sexuality. They're not always. He also has some sweeter stories about marriage. But so the dirtiness and the minimalism is both the minimal means that his characters have in terms of the contents of the stories, as well as the extremely minimal way in which he writes about them. And why is it dirty realism? Because he emphasizes the unpleasantness, the dirtiness of their lives. And so that is the sort of headline there. And because his stories are so minimalist in style, so spare and sparse in style and tone, one of the things that his bio in the anthology emphasizes is that this showed that realism could rise to the challenge of postmodern experimentation. Because you remember what we said when we defined realism weeks ago. We said that it was realist stories mainly focused on everyday life, usually of the working classes or the middle classes, and tended to be written in a somewhat transparent or easily understood style, as opposed to postmodern experimentation and writers like Pynchon and Paley, who are always calling attention somehow metafictionally to the text itself. They don't allow the words of the text to transparently convey the content of the text. They're always calling attention to themselves. Well, Carver shows that realism doesn't have to be quote unquote naive in this way. It can also have a really interesting formal artistic surface, which he achieves by this extreme minimalism. So that's what they say in the anthology. They say, readers of experimental postmodern writers might have felt that simple realism was no longer an up-to-date way in which to write. Raymond Carver proved that it was, and that previous challenges to realistic tradition had only made it all the more effective, especially when those challenges are incorporated in the new style. So by writing a stylistically fresh form of realism, Carver incorporates the postmodern challenge into his own style. So you have a formally inventive, formally interesting form of realism, one that's not just naively transparent. Now, we're just for the purposes of this discussion assuming that previous versions of realism we read were naive, but I don't think that Flannery O'Connor or James Baldwin or Philip Roth were naive. So actually I somewhat call into question the ease of this assumption that only experimental fiction can be sophisticated. But nevertheless, that's what they wanted to emphasize in the anthology. Excuse me. However, strangely, in many ways, the most interesting thing about Raymond Carver, at least in my opinion, I'm not like a big fan of Raymond Carver's stories, and I don't know how interesting they are to talk about, at least not for me. But the most interesting thing about him is not in his stories, but is the story of how his stories got written. Because you might be thinking, you might have been thinking as I was just talking, that you read Cathedral. That's the story by him that's in the Norton Anthology. And you might have been thinking, well, I didn't think it was all that spare and sparse and minimal. It just seemed like sort of a normal story. There wasn't much experimental about it. Well, right, because that's a story of his later period. The stories he became known for in his earlier period that were sort of called Carveresque and minimalist and dirty realist, they were written under a somewhat peculiar set of circumstances that his later works, such as Cathedral, were not written under. And so if Cathedral just looks like a normal short story that doesn't have this extreme style that I've been talking about, it's because it is. And it's because his early stories weren't fully written by him. So here's the story. After Raymond Carver's death, so he has a hard life, as we've talked about. He's born to the working class. He struggles with alcoholism throughout his life. He was a heavy smoker throughout his life. He had a abusive first marriage. That is to say, he was an abuser in his first marriage, which was coinciding with his period of alcohol dependency. And then he does turn his life around later, and he becomes a teacher of creative writing, and he has a second marriage to the poet Tess Gallagher, which by all accounts was a very close and very loving marriage, and he becomes a successful writer, though he does die early of cancer, probably due to his smoking and drinking. But so when he starts out as a writer in the late 60s, he's submitting his stories to editors, and he was discovered by this man named Gordon Lish, who's a writer himself, but also was a very high-powered editor, first at the magazine Esquire, and then he was an editor at a major book publisher, I think Knopf, Knopf. Maybe it's just Knopf. I don't know. I don't go to cocktail parties in Manhattan. I don't know how it's pronounced. But he was a high-powered editor in the magazine world and then the publishing world, Gordon Lish. And Gordon Lish, as an editor, had very definite ideas about what fiction should be. And he often exercised this idea by editing the works of the writers he published in a very severe way. And he would particularly do this, I believe, to writers like Carver, who would come into his orbit without having a lot of power to begin with. Because certain writers that he worked with were already sort of established writers by the time he's taking them on, or they already kind of agree with him, and so he's not sort of slashing their work to bits. But he did slash Carver's work to bits. Carver would submit stories, and Lish would say, sure, I'll publish these, but I have some changes I'd like to make. And he would change the stories extremely. He would cut, and they were always cuts, because the thing is, it was Lish who was the minimalist. It was Lish who believed that stories should be incredibly spare and sparse and cut to the bone. And Lish also had this theory that the main interest of fiction was not what it was about. Carver, I think, sincerely wanted to tell stories that reflected his life and experiences. Lish was much more the postmodern experimenter who had views similar to those we saw in William H. Gass as the medium of fiction. For Lish, fiction was about the production of interesting sentences. It didn't matter what those sentences described. And so Lish would treat Carver almost as raw material for the production of more interesting sentences. So he would just cut anytime he found anything overly explained, anytime he found anything sentimental, anytime he found anything wordy, he would cut down Carver's stories by almost 30 to 50%. And he particularly favored abrupt, kind of nihilistic endings, like, and then the room went dark, or and then he hit her with a rock and killed her. Like, he liked to sort of almost these grotesquely punchline-like violent endings. And it's really, I think, Lish who's responsible for the severe minimalism, the dirty realism, the almost nihilism of Carver's early style. Carver resented this. He wanted to fight back against this. And then once he got famous enough for the stories he did with Lish, he was able to throw off Lish's influences and write stories more the way he wanted to write them, which were, we might say, more conventionally realist. And critics at the time, who I think didn't know or didn't want to talk publicly about the influence of Lish, would often say there's been this great change in Carver's work. It's more expansive, the stories are longer, and they feel more humanistic and more emotional and less nihilistic and dark and dirty and gritty and grim. And some people like the early stuff and some people like the later stuff. Cathedral is an example, as you'll see, of the later Carver. It's kind of Carver, if you'll forgive the pun, unleashed. Carver, so the pun is on unleashed. You shouldn't explain a joke. But anyway, it's Carver writing a story the way he wants to write it and not being subject to this severe editing. So what is, how should we think of this? How should we think of this conflict of these two sensibilities? I don't know. It's complicated. So first of all, obviously there's an ethical question. You have this high-powered editor who's receiving submissions from a writer that's not very powerful or well-known, and writing stories about his own world, his own experiences about working class and lower middle class life. And I think in a sense, by the way, I understand that Raymond Carver is a white man, but I think in a sense his work is also became popular because of that milieu of identity politics, of multiculturalism, that he was the voice of a particular class. Yes, of a class of white people, though he didn't in any way exclusively write about men. He wrote about men and women. And so he was the voice of a particular identity, a voice of a particular experience. And so I think in that way, despite his own white male status, his work belongs in a certain sense to that multicultural moment where no one writer was assumed to be the voice of universal grand narratives speaking. Everybody was the voice of a kind of identity. And so I think Carver belongs to that moment. And so there's an ethical question here about the high-powered editor saying, well, sure, I'll publish your work about your world and your identity and your life once I've, brought it up to my own sophisticated standards. So there's an ethical qualm there, of course. On the other hand, so given the way I've described it, you might think that that I object to what Lish did, but the fact is that I think Lish's stories, the stories that Lish worked on, are more interesting than the stories Carver wrote later. I think the stories Carver wrote later kind of are just regular, not particularly fascinating short stories. To be perfectly honest, that's my opinion. It need not be yours, and other people would disagree. I just think there's nothing particularly interesting about the stories Carver wrote later, whereas there is something startling about this severity of the minimalism in his early work that he worked on with Lish. And I do think there's problems with that too, because there's a mismatch between what they're trying to do. So Carver is trying to tell sincere stories. Lish thinks this is naive, so he wants to turn them into aesthetically interesting objects. And so you have these sincere stories run through this machine that brings them out as these nihilistic works of pitiless art. And so this mismatch in intentions, I think, creates a jarring effect that's aesthetically interesting, but also a little bit disturbing. The stories seem almost like cruel jokes. And so I indict myself for preferring cruel jokes to more humanistic short stories. And I appreciate the humanism of Carver's later work. It's just that it's also not written in a way that's very compelling from a literary critical standpoint. This is my opinion. I have mixed feelings. I have severely mixed feelings about this subject. So I have a few quotes on the next slide that are just about it's from the article that was published in the New York Times in 1998, so 10 years after Carver's death, that revealed this to the world. So this was not known during Carver's lifetime. It wasn't even known 10 years after his death. And mind you, this is the most influential short story writer of his generation, and this strange fact that probably changes the way one thinks of his work was not known during this period in which he was being enshrined this way. So there was an article called The Carver Chronicles by D.T. Max, published in the New York Times in 1998, that really revealed this to the broader reading public for the first time. I think people in the literary world knew, I think some academics knew, but this is the story that sort of brings it out. And I just wanted to read a couple excerpts from this piece by D.T. Max, the biographer. First of all, Max talks about what Carver's work meant to his generation. He says, he talks about his claim on us, why we loved him, why he meant so much to us, to our generation of writers. He says it goes deeper than his work. Born in the rural Northwest, Carver was the child of an alcoholic sawmill worker and a waitress. He first learned to write through a correspondence course. He lived in poverty and suffered multiple bouts of alcoholism throughout his 30s. He struggled in a difficult marriage with his high school girlfriend, Marianne Burke. Through it all, he remained a generous, determined man. I don't know if Marianne Burke would agree with that, by the way, but okay. Fiction's comeback kid. By 1980, he had quit drinking and moved in with Tess Gallagher, with whom he spent the rest of his life. So, again, this goes back to this idea of how Carver, in a way, is a writer of this moment of identity politics, that he reflects a certain class experience and also the way in which he triumphed over the challenges of this class experience endeared him to a whole generation of writers, many of whom might have shared that, because we're still in this 20th century moment where there's a great deal of social mobility. There's a great deal of, first generation college students. It's possible that you could come from a lower class experience and maybe enter the middle classes later on in your life. And so Carver reflects this class experience. So that's what he meant to them. So that's why he was important to a certain generation. Then the next quote from D.T. Max I want to read is he characterizes the relationship between Lish and Carver. He says Lish was constantly on guard against what he saw as Carver's creeping sentimentality, so this overly emotional quality of his fiction. In the original manuscripts, Carver's characters talk about their feelings. They talk about regrets. When they do bad things, they cry. When Lish got hold of Carver, they stopped crying. They stopped feeling. Lish loved deadpan last lines and freely wrote them in. So that's what Lish did. He took Carver and he... I like this idea of Carver's characters cry and Lish's Carver's characters don't cry. It's almost as if he dehydrates the stories. He's like makes makes jerky. I don't know why I'm pursuing this metaphor. Makes jerky out of them. He dehydrates them. He takes all that moisture, those tears, that effluvia of human emotions, and he removes them from the stories to create this much more, exsanguinated, tough, leather-like quality. So that's how I would characterize what Lish did to Carver. Now the interesting thing, and this is the last quote I want to read, is that we mentioned that Carver has a second marriage to a fellow writer, a poet named Tess Gallagher, that's much more successful as a marriage. They're much happier as people, but also that appears to have been collaborative as well. So Max says, Gallagher emphasized that she had given Carver the original idea for Cathedral, or more, so that's the story you read, or more accurately, that he had stolen it from her. The story focuses on the discomfort that a husband feels when his wife brings a blind friend into their home. Tess herself had a blind acquaintance whom she talked about with Carver. She said she was planning to write a story about him when Carver scooped her. In addition, Gallagher claimed that she had written or helped shape several key lines. She spoke of the story as a joint effort. So who has a claim on this story? I don't know. But one of the things that interests me about this is that Carver seems almost to have needed collaborators in a way that maybe other writers don't or wouldn't admit to. That even this story, Cathedral, that is famously one of the stories he writes without the collaboration of Lish, he writes with the collaboration of his wife. And so there's something about Carver's nature as a writer that seems to require this joint effort somehow. So those are the things I wanted to point out from this article. So now we can talk about the story itself. As I said, I don't really love this story. I've never quite gotten the big deal about it. I know I criticize the Norton editors for being very editorializing in their biographies of the writers, but that's because I think they should just give facts. A lecture is supposed to have personality. At least that's what I tell myself. So personally speaking, from the point of view of my personality, I don't really love this story. But the story basically is about this man, his wife, who has been married before. She was in an unsuccessful marriage, and they live this life, seemingly suburban, lower middle class life. He's unhappy in his job, but he doesn't have any other options. They seem to drink very heavily. There's this alcoholism focus throughout the Carver's work. And his wife has this friend, a man who is blind, and she met him when she worked as his kind of assistant in his job. And then they exchanged a correspondence of tapes, cassette tapes. So this auditory rather than visual correspondence. And then he comes to visit. And the overall arc of the story is that our narrator is kind of not a nice person, apparently, and he's very judgmental, and he thinks in stereotypes about disability, and even in other moments of the story about race and other things. And he is also, there seems to be an undercurrent of jealousy, that he's worried about his wife's relationship with this other man. And then when the man comes to visit, they end up having this kind of rapprochement, this kind of accord between them. Particularly, a couple things happen. One of them is, so first of all, one of the things that happens, they switch from liquor to marijuana. And this appears to be a change for the better that makes them mellower, makes the narrator in particular mellower and more open to new experiences and more empathetic. So Carver, I think, is making a point there about the merits and demerits of various recreational mind-altering substances. So that's one thing. And then the narrator eventually helps the man to draw a cathedral when they're watching this cathedral on TV. And the blind man has never seen a cathedral. And so he's asking the narrator to describe it. And the narrator tries, but doesn't really work, or he can't convey it somehow. And so they end up, the blind man says, well, let's draw it together. And so they join hands over a pencil, and together they draw it. And this is the climax of the story. So what is this all about? What does this mean? I think one of the things it means is obvious, which is this goes back to something we talked about in the work of James Baldwin. And this is something that is always discussed as a particular benefit of realist fiction as opposed to other kinds of fiction, which is that it helps us as readers to feel empathy for other people. It's hard to feel empathy for other people in postmodern experimentalist fiction because you're not really getting a 100% earnest depiction of other people as characters. You're getting this kind of screen of textual experimentation. And then in other genres, like in particular science fiction, empathy is not really the point, because often you're being exposed to a completely different world from your own, an imagined world that raises certain philosophical or intellectual or political inquiries, and you're not really meant to identify with the characters necessarily. It's realist fiction that is said to help us feel empathy because it's set in our own time, it's set in our own world, and it's about people in our world, fictional characters, who stand in for people that we could meet in our own world. And it helps us to identify with them and feel what they feel. With the idea, I think ultimately the effect of this by people who say that this is the virtue of a certain kind of realist fiction is that it will help us treat other people better because we'll know how they feel. And so this development of empathy in an originally rather judgmental and bigoted narrator he gradually comes to understand how the blind man feels. And then at the end of the story, he is closes his eyes and doesn't open them as he's drawing. And so he takes on this experience of blindness to feel what the blind man feels. And so this development of empathy is what's going on in the story. And I think in particular, we see that it's put in the context because the story is called Cathedral, and they're watching this documentary on public television about cathedrals and about, I think, like the church in the Middle Ages. And at one point, the narrator says, in the olden days, God was an important part of everybody's life. You could tell this from their cathedral building. And I think the idea is that living now in a world where religion has substantially retreated, particularly Christianity has substantially retreated, it's no longer this part of everyday life, and therefore God is not so much an important part of everyone's everyday life. The moral basis of Christianity has also gone away with its injunctions to love your neighbor as yourself. And so then why should we treat people well if this religion that told us to do so has gone into eclipse in our society? And I think the story suggests that empathy can be this replacement for religion. That we no longer have cathedrals, we no longer have the church as part of our everyday life, we no longer necessarily have God as part of our everyday life. In this, I mean, some people do, but I think the point is, maybe even many people, most people do. I don't know how many people do, but the point is, whether you do or not, the society is much more secular overall than it was 1,000 years ago, is the point. So in a secular society, what do we have to hold that society together? Well, I think this story suggests that empathy becomes that substitute for the closeness of God and the ethical injunctions of the Christian religion. And so that's the point of my second quotation on this slide. My first quotation on this slide is even at the beginning of the story, when the narrator is at his most sympathetic, he does have this digression where he's trying to imagine the blind man's. So the blind man had been married, and then his wife dies of cancer. There's that grim line, she must have carried the cancer in her glands already. So it's always the Carver, they call it Carver country, the world of Raymond Carver stories is always extremely grim. It's all sort of alcoholism and cancer. But the narrator begins to imagine what her life was like and what it would be like to be married to a blind man. And much of what he says is sort of phrased in this unsympathetic way. Who'd want to go to such a wedding, he thinks, like sort of brutally, like who'd want to go to a blind man's wedding, he thinks in this kind of cruel way. But he says, I found myself thinking what a pitiful life this woman must have led, which sounds judgmental, but then he says, imagine a woman who could never see herself as she was seen in the eyes of her loved one. A woman who could go on day after day and never receive the smallest compliment from her beloved. A woman whose husband could never read the expression on her face, be it misery or something better. So he does start thinking his way into her feeling and begins to empathize with her. And this comes to its climax, its epiphany. Remember the importance of the epiphany to the realist short story, this kind of concluding realization. And again, not so much on the part of the characters. I think that's a misunderstanding about the epiphany as an idea. But for the reader, the story ends with some radiant revelation of the truth of the situation. And this story ends with this epiphany of empathy, where the blind man says, close your eyes now. I did it. I closed them, just like he said. Are they closed, he said? Don't fudge. They're closed, I said. Keep them that way, he said. He said, don't stop now. Draw. So we kept on with it. His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now. Then he said, I think that's it. I think you got it, he said. Take a look. What do you think? But I had my eyes closed. I thought I'd keep them that way for a little longer. I thought it was something I ought to do. Well, he said, are you looking? My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything. It's really something, I said. So you have that understated last line, it's really something, but the understatement points out, ironically, the height of the emotion he's feeling, which is he no longer feels contained by his prejudices, by his expectations, by the kind of spurious privilege of what he had taken for his ability to see that the blind man lacked. He now he sort of realizes what the blind man has that he doesn't, and they sort of have this moment of almost erotic communion. His fingers rode my fingers. This verb to ride, it has I think an erotic connotation among other things. And so he has this expansion of his self, of his sensibility to include more reality. And so that's why I call this epiphanic empathy, or this, maybe I should have said this empathetic epiphany, of this expansion of his own self, to feel more and different and better kinds of emotions than we had seen from him at the beginning. And Carver himself, in an interview, said that he particularly appreciated this story. He said, and it's interesting, he says, "It's the first story I wrote after finishing What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, and I'd let 6 months go by." Now, what his readers, the people reading this interview back in the 80s, didn't know is that the story collection, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, is the last one that had been substantially edited by Lish. And it's a collection full of grim, severely minimalist, dirty realism. And he says, Cathedral begins a new period for me. What he's not telling the reader, what the reader doesn't know, is it begins his first period as himself, without this interference from Lish. And so this is the story he wants to write. Then when I wrote that story, I felt it was truly different. I felt a real impetus in writing it, and that doesn't happen with every story. But I felt I'd tapped into something. I felt it was very exciting. The sighted man changes. He puts himself in the blind man's place. The story affirms something. It's a positive story, and I like it a lot for that reason. People say it's a metaphor for some other thing, for art, for making. But no, I thought about the physical contact of the blind man's hand on his hand. It's imaginary. Nothing like that ever happened to me. So he says, I like this story because it's the first story I had written that's affirmative, that's positive, that's moral, teaches a moral lesson, put yourself in other people's place. And again, what the readers don't know is this is what he'd wanted to do all along. It was Lish. Well, maybe I'm overstating it, but for the purposes of this lecture, it was Lish who turned his earlier fiction in a more nihilistic, more amoral direction. So what Carver wants to do is stress this empathy, this affirmation. And so what does it mean that for a lot of readers, the non-empathetic version, the more experimental nihilistic version was the more interesting? Maybe it means that aesthetics and ethics don't always align. But for the moment, let's focus on the ethics. This is a story that does have this ethical impetus. Feel empathy, put yourself in other people's places, feel what they feel, and expand your sensibility to include other people. So that's Raymond Carver, and that's the end of this lecture. Thanks very much.